Welcome, everyone. I think we're going to give just another minute for people to get settled. You're going to want to find the chat as you arrive. Okay, let's get started this morning. And good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. Today's webinar is hosted by Maryland Online, and we're going to be focused on building culturally sound communication strategies for online and remote learning. I want to talk about some housekeeping details and let you know about how today is going to be set up. So during the webinar, you're going to have an opportunity to submit questions in the chat. And so the first half of the webinar is going to be Professor Walker talking us through those strategies for culturally sound communications. And then the second half is really going to be a Q&A. So as you go through, if you have questions, leave them there in the chat and they're going to be addressed in that second half. There's also going to be an opportunity to volunteer in a polling experience for the first 25 people who want to join that polling experience. You can find directions to join the polling in the chat now. And so just scroll to the top and you'll be able to see how to join that. Okay. We will also be recording this webinar and we'll be sharing a link to that and other resources after the event. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Professor Crystal Lynese Walker. She's our assistant professor and co-chair of training and curriculum inclusion of diversity at Howard Community College. And I'll tell you, I'm Megan Myers, and I'm the Director of eLearning at Howard Community College, and I have been so lucky to work with Professor Walker. Professor Walker has been instrumental at our campus in developing a research-based roadmap for eLearning, for identifying issues that hinder student success, and in innovating systemic solutions. Her work in building inclusion and equity across campus, as well as online best practices, when she does that, she brings this incredible ability to build consensus and insightful ways to view situations. Today, we're so lucky because she's going to work with us on techniques to build inclusive communication spaces, to model culturally sound practices, and to help develop our cultural intelligence. So without further ado, Professor Crystal Walker.
Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be here and so excited. Thank you, Megan, for such an introduction. I know that for all fellow educators and for those who are not educators on the call, hearing about yourself can sometimes feel awkward and weird. And in a virtual environment, I'm like, what do I do with my hands? I don't know where to look anymore because everything has gone virtual and everyone's cameras are in different places. But I'm so excited that all of you are here. We are living during a global pandemic. I know that we all know that, but to hear that, I'm gonna say it again, we are living through a global pandemic, which means if we are educators, we are still living and now teaching and assisting others who are living and working through this. If you're not an educator that's on this call, some of the principles that we discussed today are going to be beneficial for any type of team that you have. When I was originally approached for this, this was typically focused on higher education. However, our registration quickly grew and we realized that there were lots of K through 12 educators and instructors who are also on the call. And so one of the things I want to note before we get started is that any of these practices can be tailored to any age group and to what you find as appropriate for the subject matter that you teach, right? In higher education, most of us have very specific classes that we teach, but maybe in K through 12, you may be responsible for teaching multiple types of courses. And so just keep those things in mind. One thing that I like to do is I don't like lecturing. And so I don't do it in my in-person class, and I try to find ways to not do it when I'm doing workshops as well as online. And one way to do that is to bring in some interaction. So I'm going to ask that I get 25 volunteers. So what I posted in the chat, that we're gonna be doing a little poll everywhere. And if I can get 25 folks to use their cell phones or any other electronic device that you have to log into that poll everywhere, we're gonna be polling you. Now it's completely anonymous, you don't have to give your name, but this is a way for us to get some interaction. So while my volunteers are running virtually to go help out, I'm gonna talk about what we're gonna be doing today. So my objectives for this, as we know as educators, having objectives are important. One, I want you all to learn culturally inclusive concepts and terms. It's important to know these terms so that you know where you fall with the actions and behaviors that you decide to implement and take. Understand the basic concepts of culturally intelligent communication in learning. Identify techniques to build inclusive communication spaces and help you build a culturally sound practice plan for implementation. In other words, when you leave here today, I'm going to be able to help you, or you're going to be able to help yourself actually have an action plan on some things that you can begin to do, and not just theoretical framework, because I believe that there comes a time where we need to take theoretical framework and put it into action. That's the only way that we know if what we're doing is working. So I can't see like the chat and my screen. So Megan, can you confirm whether or not we've got folks volunteering?
So I reposted the poll, and I think that that is meaning that more people can see it again, because we had so many people greeting each other in such a warm way that the poll got buried. But I think that now people are seeing it again and linking to the poll.
Sounds great. Thank you.
So I think give him maybe 30 more seconds and we'll be all
set.
No
problem. So I'm gonna go over some of these concepts and terms while people are still getting involved in, and then we'll tackle it. So this is what I call culturally inclusive concepts, kind of a fundamentals 101. We've all heard the words diversity, equity, equality, inclusion, and belonging, and there could be varying definitions of these concepts. However, I like to have very straightforward information. And so this is a way for me to explain what the differences are and how they may work in a learning environment. So as I start talking about these concepts, I want you to start visualizing how this might look or what this might mean in your class or how in your teaching. So first, diversity. This is actually the degree of human differences among members of a defined group. And the key to this is that they can be representative of characteristics that are both seen and unseen. So there are lots of times where we want to look at diversity as only being something that can be physically seen in a room. However, you may have people who look very homogeneous as in physicality, but their thought process and other things that we can't always see in certain areas may still exist for them. Equality is treating everyone the same way. But this is often while assuming that everyone also started out on an equal footing or with the same opportunity. Equity is recognizing and considering and providing support to others, utilizing the realization that everyone did not start off at the same footing and that they may face specific obstacles. Equity can sometimes be hard because in education, we often talk about fairness, and fairness has been the rhetoric of equality, which means treating every student, every learner the same. But what we have found in education is that our students, as well as our colleagues, need equity when there are obstacles that have gotten in their way in order for them to achieve the same level or at least have the same opportunity. Inclusion is the involvement and empowerment where the inherent worth and dignity of everyone is encouraged, recognized, valued, and most importantly, utilized. We often hear people say things like, oh, they're offering seats at the table. Well, a seat at the table may represent diversity and a seat at the table may look inclusive. But if the voices at that table are not actually valued nor utilized, then it is not an inclusive environment. It just might be a diverse environment. The next term is belonging. And this is creating spaces or to have the opportunity for people to bring their whole self and all of the intersections of their identity into the space. And more importantly, where diversity, equity, and inclusion are being practiced actively for them to get that sense of belonging. In other words, I don't have to, for example, maybe code switching is something that you have to do at work. Code switching, it might be something that your students feel like they need to do. If you haven't heard of code switching, is when you change the language that you utilize in order to make those around you either comfortable or to try to blend into what you consider to be the standard. So for example, I grew up in a small town called Red Springs, North Carolina. And if there are any people on the call that are from back home, hi. But we lived in this very small town, and down south, we often call, if I go to the grocery store or if I'm going to Target or some store and I want to get a shopping cart, I learned that up here, I'm in Maryland now, you call it a shopping cart, right? But down south, especially North Carolina, we call it a buggy, right? And so one of the things that I found was that when I moved here, even with people I was considering friends and meeting, when I would say the word buggy, I would get this look like, what is that? And sometimes it gave me the sense that someone thought that I was less intelligent because I used a different word that someone else might use. And so I started saying shopping cart. Well, then when I go home, right, and I say, oh, get me a cart, everyone, my family's like, you mean a buggy? Because that's what you've been calling it, right? So I was stuck in this straddling, and belonging is being able to call it a buggy because that is part of my cultural intersection and identity and the language that I come from. And other people may have questions about it and say, hey, why do you call it a buggy? And I can say, I don't know why we call it a buggy. That's just what we call it. And they go about their day, and it doesn't make me feel ostracized for using it. That is an example of creating belonging. That's very different from diversity and inclusion. So those are just some baseline terms. And if you have any questions about those terms, you can post those and Megan will be gathering those questions. But let's get ready to have a little bit of an interaction. So hopefully we've got the 25 folks are all logged in and that you haven't had any issues. This is what, for those of you who are not going to be actively participating using the poll everywhere, I do want you to jot down your responses to these questions. These are going to be just true or false questions. One thing I want to say, this is a no judgment zone. This is also a place of learning. So I need you to be honest with yourself. Because the only way that this information is going to be impactful is if you're able to be honest and really take a step and think about how you're using communication and creating inclusive space. So if you all are ready, here we go. A racial minority student in my classroom will see themselves presented in our materials throughout the semester. And the key word here was throughout, because sometimes I find that we find places in which we will immediately say that we want to acknowledge someone. For example, during Native American History Week, or during Hispanic or Latinx History or Heritage Month, or during Black History Month, or during Women's Equality Rights Month. Like, we'll start wanting to do that, but your classes may not fall in that semester during that time frame. So I'm asking specifically, will they see themselves throughout the entire semester and not just in areas in which they are highlighted because there's a national movement at the time? So 80% of you say that that's true, 20% of you say that that is false, okay? And let's go to the next one. I'm familiar with those in my field who differ in gender, race, ethnicity, ability, and so on. And so what I mean here is, you know, if you are in the women's studies division, right? Are you looking at people who are outside of your own gender, race, ethnicity, and even ability? And when I talk about ability, that could be physical as well as psychological, as well as physiological abilities that people may have. One of the things that you'll find is being aware of others in your field may help you to help create more inclusive spaces for your students. All right, I share my commitment to inclusion and diversity with my students. Now, a bit of context for this is, do you share it and where they can find it and not have to assume that this is what you mean? So as opposed to saying, talking to your students and saying things such as, I'm really committed to inclusion and diversity, or, I really want us to talk about this. Is there somewhere that they can go back and track, your commitment? Is there a statement somewhere, right? So 80% of you say yes, that's great. Oh, we've got some changes happening, and that's okay. All right, next question. If a student comes out to me as LGBTQ+, I can react positively and I know where to send them for campus resources. And it's okay, this question is two parts. So it says I can react positively and I know where to send them for campus resources. You may be in a position where you can act positively, but you don't know about the campus resources. So that might make your answer false. So that's completely understandable. And it may be a situation where you know what the campus resources are, but you don't know whether or not your response, even if your intention is positive, that it may come off positive. And that's okay too. All right, I shy away from topics that could be potentially controversial or uncomfortable. True or false? Okay, so 72% of you say I am completely comfortable and I at least go for these controversial. And those who say it's true, that's okay. That's very understandable as educators. It doesn't want to go. Okay. I provide options for students to explore their own experiences within assignments. That's excellent. If someone corrects me on my language or behavior, I respond by making a change. And one of the things I want to reiterate here is that I want you to consider if this someone is not an authority figure, but is also a student at any age, would you be willing to respond by making a change? Or do you? My classroom and course materials are accessible to students or guardians with disabilities. And when we talk about accessibility, we're talking about the standards, ADA standards for learning. And so I don't mean, oh, I can download it, or, oh yeah, it's available, it's sitting in this file folder, but actually talking about accessibility in terms of ADA compliance. And do note that I put or guardians because students of all ages can be in any of our class, whether you're higher education or K through 12. And sometimes the help that students are receiving from outside of ourselves or themselves, that guardian or whoever's helping them may actually have the disability. So if they can't access or the course material isn't accessible to them, it may make it hard for them to reiterate what the students are learning in your classroom because they don't have the ability to view that information.
Crystal, we had a question about the ADA. Could you just say what that stands for?
Oh yes, so so when it comes to ADA compliance, so I actually talk about it a little more later, but I will talk about it. So it's the Americans with Disability Act, and it's regulations for businesses, state and local governments, technical assistance, as well as in education, that allows for people who have various disabilities or abilities in some places to be supported. So for example, maybe you have lots of images that you share with your students, but maybe you haven't used the text captioning for those images or the alt image information, which means that a student who may not be able to see, their screen reader may not gather any information about that image, so it doesn't describe it to them. Or oftentimes we will have videos that have words and we think that having words is closed captioning, but closed captioning is quite different from having a video that actually has words on it. So those are just some examples of ADA compliance that's even more important in an online classroom environment. Great question. I welcome classroom conversations that are that revolves around current day issues. I regularly check my perceptions to make sure I am not treating someone unfairly due to stereotypes, prejudices, or bias. And this can be a hard one to answer. And I put the word regularly check because sometimes you may react in a moment and then maybe think about that later and say, you know, maybe what I said came off, and did I do it this way? Could it be considered that way? So you might have checked yourself after a situation, but the biggest thing is, do you regularly check? When it comes to matters of race and ethnicity, I don't see color. All right, so this question is going to be tied to talking about unconscious biases, but we're gonna go to that a little later. I make an effort to learn students' names, even those that are difficult for me to pronounce. Now, oftentimes students who have names who have been difficult for others to pronounce, they will create an abbreviated version of their name, or maybe even what they consider an English version of their name. And that's okay if they choose to do that. One of the things that I try to do is make sure that they know that the language in their native tongue, that I will do what I need to do in order to pronounce it, but more importantly, to help other students pronounce it, and that they don't have to change their name if they don't want to. I encourage students to discuss and ask questions about life experiences and cultures outside of their own. I know the difference between equity and equality and how those concepts could play out in my classroom. All right, so that was the last question for our poll. So I really want to thank everyone who volunteered. Thank you so much for taking that time to participate. One of the reasons I like to do that is to show that there are varying degrees on where we are on the spectrum of creating inclusive spaces, and that you may be doing some things that work really well, and I want you to know you should keep those. But you also need to be honest and find ways that you could do more or maybe make some changes. And one of the ways to do that is to start exploring some specific things that you may or may not do in your classroom. What I want everyone to do really quickly is I'm gonna tell a very quick story. And if you have experienced something similar, I want you to just mute your video, right, as soon as you hear it. And of course, at the end, you will be able to, but this will give you a visual of not being alone. How many of you have a sibling who, for the sake of this activity, I will say that either you were the victim, or maybe they were, of an accident that happened in which an injury was caused. And in that injury, right, this injury that happened and this accident that occurred, right, you did not mean it with malicious intent. However, something still happened. In other words, someone still got hurt, someone still got put on punishment, someone, anything happened. If you have been in a situation where that was a sibling or friends or, a cousin, I want you to just quickly mute your video. Someone accidentally got hurt. You didn't mean it, but it happened. Or maybe it was you, an accident happened and you end up getting hurt. I'm seeing lots of blacked out screens. One of the reasons I like to do this activity is because you all can unmute your video so we can see your beautiful faces again. There is a huge difference when we talk about cultural intelligence, whether it's when we talk about racism or misogyny or bigotry or any of the isms that can be harmful and oppressive, we often get defensive. It does not mean that you make decisions to be malicious. It doesn't mean that you are actively seeking to be racist in your class. It doesn't mean that you're actively seeking or doing things that would make someone feel ostracized. But just because it wasn't your malicious intent doesn't mean that what happened doesn't cause an injury of some sort. It doesn't take away what it actually does to someone else. And so one of the things we have to think about to do this work is to be centered that this is not all about you. This is about using strategies to be more helpful to others. And that might make you uncomfortable. You might make mistakes. You might need to be corrected or have a different course of action. And one of the things that you need to recognize is it's okay, but you can't grow if you're not willing to make a move, okay? Or hold yourself accountable. So I'm going to be talking about exploring some options. There's so many of you that I want to get to questions as soon as possible. So I'm going to be giving a brief overview. This video they're going to be recording it, or they already are. So it'll be on YouTube to go back. So I will try not to talk too fast. But if there are some areas that you want more clarification, you can post your questions. So one of the things that this talks about is cultural intelligence, and we call that CQ. And this is the ability to actually utilize cultural intelligence or cultural knowledge to communicate. One of the things that often happens is that we want very specific instructions on how to operate or communicate with a very specific type of person. The reality is you will not find such a thing. Cultural intelligence is you learning enough about various backgrounds and intersections of identities that will help you understand how maybe to best approach it. But it does not mean that it's a cookie cutter, this is going to fit for everyone. So learning to build cultural intelligence is a lifelong learning commitment that you have to be willing to do. One of the things I tell educators, the first place to start is to start with the students in your classroom, right? Like if you don't know, if this feels overwhelming, start with the ones that you have in your class and looking at what that makeup looks like and using that to start building your cultural intelligence. So I have created 4 areas for inclusive communication. The first is representation. The second is intent and expectations. The third area has to do with peer-to-peer, and the fourth has to do with assessments. So when we talk about representation, I'm talking about that diversity piece. How to convey messages that actually create an inclusive environment. And messages can be both verbal as well as nonverbal. And in communication, for those of us or anyone who are communication scholars, we know, I'm gonna cringe because this is a double negative, you cannot not communicate. I know, cringing, but I'll say it again, you cannot not communicate. So not communicating about something is a form of communicating about something. So be mindful of when you're silent, right? So thinking about the representation that you have in the lessons that you create. Your intent and expectations. You need to utilize and demonstrate inclusive behaviors so that it helps students understand and have a model for what's expected. And then that becomes part of their normal behavior when they know that it is being, that you're continuing to use it. And more importantly, we're going to talk about ways in which you can help engage with students and promote more inclusion and intent through their own behaviors. Peer-to-peer, this is where we get nervous. We're like, you know what, I can control what I say, I can control what, what information goes out, but what about the children? What about the students? Or I call my students blueberries. It's a gender neutral fruit, but it's also my favorite fruit. And I tell them they're my blueberries because I like blueberries when they're in season, out of season, when they're sour, when they're sweet, when they're not so good, I still love them. So I tell my students, you're my blueberries. I teach college students, and I can't tell you how much they absolutely love being called blueberries, which I was shocked. I get emails from them saying, hi, I've been a bad blueberry, and I know that I haven't turned in my assignment. So they embrace being called blueberries. But we know that sometimes that's where we get nervous. How do we reinforce behaviors and offer opportunities for exploration and also correction for our students in peer-to-peer situations? And last but not least, assessments. And when I talk about this, these are assignments, quizzes, what you're using to evaluate your students. And one of the things we need to talk about is considering the language and the requirements and the expectations. So let's kind of dive into these a little bit. So when we talk about representation, one, you need to have a very clear diversity statement or inclusion statement that you put in your syllabus or any kind of course material that you provide your students. When you do that, you tell them your why. Why is this important to me? And more importantly, what are ways that you're gonna see this in my classroom? It doesn't need to be long, it could be very short, but the point is, it is there and it acts as if it's a mission statement for your classroom. And that anything that you do, you can hold yourself accountable for that diversity and inclusion statement that you wrote for yourself. Are my own behaviors in alignment with this? Are my students' behaviors in alignment with this? Seek and utilize information. No one knows everything about everything and about everyone. However, let your students share their experiences. For example, in the beginning of my class, I have where students have to do like a course orientation quiz where they're answering questions about the course, right? So I can make sure that they went over everything. One of the questions that I had is there anything about me or you that you want me to know that can help me help you be successful? And as broad of a question that is, I get responses like, do we have to record ourselves for anything for this class because I have to wear hijab and I'm not allowed to post my videos? Sometimes it's I'm a single parent and I don't have people here to help me during X, Y, and Z day. Is there something that I can get from that? Sometimes I find out about students who have disabilities or abilities that are not documented and they don't have the money to get them documented to get official help. And they just want me to know that something exists. And I find that having that space opens up dialogue, and more importantly, I can track my students. I know this is a way for me to build equity. I know that I might have a student I need to check on a little bit more than another student over here. Is that fair? It is fair because I'm giving the student who told me what they needed, what they needed. And then I do those checks throughout the semester, not just in the beginning, because they may find out something later. Offer support and representation. One of the questions that I asked was, how often do you utilize content that can represent your students, right? This takes work. If you want to try this at home, do a Google search and type in like college student and look at images. And I promise you the first 10 are going to be white, able-bodied students that show up. Unfortunately, our algorithms have over history have seen that when we talk about that, there's a baseline for what that looks like. So thinking about what you use, whether or not you use lectures or PowerPoints or books or images, or sometimes my students watch movies or different TV shows to analyze different things, try finding ones that are outside of your own comfort zone. And more importantly, finding ones that could be representative of your students. It may not represent every single student that you have, but thinking about that, this means requiring a little bit more work from you. But offering that support and representation, and communicate on a micro and macro level with your students. In other words, that student who's reached out, who has said, I actually had a student, I was teaching a public speaking course, and her concern, because the videos need to go on YouTube to embed into my class, her concern was her religion didn't allow for a public video of her. And so she was concerned. And so one of the things that we came up with is that anyone in our class, including you, can unlist your video so that no one can see it but just us. And I reiterated how much to my students that it was important that they only watched it within the course classroom. And then I told her I would grade her speeches first, so that as soon, like I graded her first instead of in alphabetical order, so that she could take the video down. Right? So like that was a way to accommodate. So that was communicating with her on a micro level about what she needed. On the macro level is sending out announcements to your students, talking about things that are going on, acknowledging that they are going through things that have nothing to do with the classroom, and making sure that everyone has access to that information. Next is intent and expectation. And this is where that whole, oops, I made a mistake, sibling fell off the porch, not that that's what happened to me, but still ended up having an injury. Number one, you cannot be afraid to address the elephants, right? Recently, there has been a huge push for Black Lives Matter. There has also been murders that we have, unfortunately, because of technology, seen and witnessed on live video. And that can be traumatizing. It doesn't matter if your students are in K through 12 or higher education. No one is without void of knowing that these things are happening. Now, to the degree that they want to learn more, it's up to them, but don't go silent in those moments. Even if you put out a message to students to say, these are resources that exist if anyone is having a hard time, if anyone needs to cope with anything, right? Like, being visual and addressing the elephants, don't act like things aren't happening on the outside world, because your students are taking those in even when they come in. You're bringing them in, right? And it can be hard for anyone. So make sure that you're okay with addressing the elephants in the room. Create accessible materials, right? So as I talked about, we use Canvas at Howard Community College, and Canvas has this option for if I'm gonna have an image in an announcement or in an assignment. It has an alt text box where I can now type, a description of the image, as descriptive as I can be. Well, if a student has a screen reader, the student screen reader will now read them a description of that image, right? But if there's no alt text there, then that student who may not be able to see will have no idea what that image looks like or any kind of context behind it. Making sure that you're closed captioning videos. If you upload them to YouTube, YouTube has an automatic closed caption, but it doesn't mean it meets all the standards. One of the things that I do when I'm recording videos is I actually make a script. So then I take my script and I copy and paste it into a text format and put it into YouTube. But I also give the script to students to download, because again, it not only provides accessible materials, but it also gives students a different way of acknowledging different learning styles. Some students like videos, some don't like watching videos. I actually had a student who said videos give them anxiety. And so they preferred having things written out in text. And so just finding different ways to touch base with your students. Again, you can't do everything all the time in every instance, but you want to interweave as much of it as you can. Some of your institutions may actually have departments, like our eLearning department works with us, along with our professional development departments who have resources. So reach out. And if you are finding that your school doesn't, that's something that you should be advocating for and talking about ways to build that up to make this accessible to students. One of the things is that accessibility takes a lot of work on the front end, but it is very rewarding on the back end. And more importantly, once you've done it once, you're going to be able to utilize that accessible material, even if you're not in an online environment, right? Even if these are materials that reinforce what you've done in the classroom. Peer-to-peer, this is where things get scary, right? I have a 3-step process. The first being develop that netiquette statement and rules for your classroom. So netiquette is basically an easy way, as my mother would say, it's minding your manners online. That's what netiquette means. Creating specific behaviors. Now, some of your institutions may have a netiquette statement. If they do, post it in your class, but more importantly, reiterate that and how you want that to play out. Rules for your classroom. One of the things that I found is I actually have my students develop our own netiquette as well as diversity statement for our class in a discussion, and it's amazing what they come up with. Because sometimes they come up with things that are far beyond what I would have thought of, or sometimes I doubt what they will come up with. And so it gives them some ownership, and it helps me check my own perceptions of what I thought my students were capable of coming up with. And like helping them, reminding them of that. Step 2, create engaging opportunities for inclusive perspectives. So this is where, if you utilize discussions in higher education or even in K through 12, and your students are responding to one another, create engaging opportunities that's not a simple yes or no, and give them the opportunity where possible to interweave their own personal experiences. So even if you're in a math class and you're talking about certain formulas, how might that formula relate to segregation or redlining? Or even if you are a first grade teacher who creating like math word problems, thinking about who you include in your math word problems. What language do you use that may help them learn something, but also understand the math? This is where being creative is important. My third step here is engage, monitor, and mimic the rules of engagement and align your assessment with the values for inclusion. In other words, if you are seeing students who are disagreeing with one another, but they're doing so using inclusive language, praise them for that. Let them know, like, this is great. Like, and again, I will do this. Sometimes I call it my discussion rock stars. When I do weekly announcements to like recap what we're doing, I'll say, shout out to Megan, like she, and I can only see some of your names. So she and Wendy, did really great with having an inclusive conversation. Even though they, didn't have the same ideas or opinions. I find that my students will go flock back because students love what they consider to be a good gossip or something to go read. So they'll go flock back and go look at it, and then they realize they might have missed it, but then they're like, oh, that's what she means by creating an inclusive space. Another thing here to note is when I say mimicking those behaviors, if you've got a student who has identified different pronouns, as you can see, I've got she, her, and mine. I often tell instructors, put your pronouns there. That may mean something for some of your students. For other students, they may not even know what that means, and that's okay. But we're normalizing that because some students may not go by pronouns that you assume that they go by. And so the other thing is that making note, taking that extra time to note those students who utilize different pronouns. And so that when you are addressing those students in the discussion, you use their pronouns. Because when you use their pronouns, other students are going to start using those pronouns. So you're mimicking that behavior and not being afraid to say something and creating an environment where a student would feel comfortable with saying something. Building inclusive assessments. And the important thing here is 3 steps. 1, inclusive development. When you're thinking about your assignments, whether it's the due date of the assignment or what it is or what objective you have in mind, can you potentially get the same results giving and providing students with different options, right? So some of your students may not have access to the computer nearly as often as others, especially during this pandemic when everyone may be sharing information or maybe sharing devices with one another. And so thinking about making sure that not just what you want is inclusive, but also the language that you're using. Are you using language that might make another student feel ostracized in the description? Are you using words that as a professor, I forget that sometimes I'm using a word and I get students who are like, Professor, I have not seen that word before. What do you mean? Right? And I have to realize I need to step it down a notch. Not only will I step it down a notch, I'll make an announcement to say, I apologize. I realize that I said this, and although this word means XYZ, I've used or replaced it with this. 1, so that they can see that I'm willing to make changes. 2, they can also now learn whatever the new word was. And 3, they can understand the context of what it means to be corrected and be okay with that correction because it will help them. Provide options. This was something I struggled with, quite frankly, because I'm like, I don't want to provide options. I have things to do. I don't want to go around the bend. But one of the things I started doing was I realized that I probably had way too many assignments. And what happens if I scaled assignments back and then gave options for the few that I had? And then I created what I call low impact activities, like discussions or worksheets where they can make a mistake. And it wasn't about them getting it correct, but about them learning something and getting some feedback from me. I would rather spend my time doing that than having these, 10 major graded assignments, because again, global pandemic, we don't know what our students have access to, and we don't know about the resources and what they're going through outside of class. And although we think, oh, we're at home, we can do this, I'm pretty sure that a lot of you can attest to the fact that being at home has not made this job any easier. In some ways, it's made it more challenging. And for some of our students, they're layering that on top of school, along with some other responsibilities as we've all had to navigate. And last but not least, provide focused feedback. I utilize rubrics to help hold myself accountable for inclusive metrics and communication, but also for providing students with that equity and looking at different areas. But when I give actual comment and feedback, I tend to focus on what they've shared with me, right? So if a student shares with me something traumatic, or if a student shares with me something from their personal life, I always thank them for being open and willing to talk about that. And I make it a point for them to know that I read this beyond just grading you for, whether the paper was well structured in APA format, but I also really appreciated the content that you took the time to provide. So last but not least is all about building a plan. And the 4 steps to this is identifying what your own strengths and weaknesses are. Developing cultural intelligence is going to help you decide more specific actions that you can take. 2, develop a diversity statement or commitment to inclusion. Some of you might have that in like a teaching philosophy. 3, choose 1 to 2 changes that you want to implement. Okay, I recognize that maybe my textbook doesn't have too many other images of students, so I'm going to find a way to supplement it. Or maybe, you know what, I've never shared my pronouns, nor have asked students what their pronouns are. I'm going to start doing so. 4, keep building that cultural intelligence and repeat this plan in your building process. As a bonus, all of you are going to get a planning toolkit to begin mapping out strategies. You will receive that after this event via email. And that's just a bonus that I've created because we had to go through this pretty quickly, but it kind of walks you through these steps and you'll be able to create an actual plan that's going to help you implement and find some strategies that will work for you. So now my last thing before we go to questions is I have an inclusivity check that I do for myself. Anytime I want to either implement something, remove something, or replace it, I check it to see if it's going to be inclusive. And I do that by inputting it into these blanks. So I want to implement, remove, replace blank because it does or does not support blank. By doing blank, learners will blank and I will blank. And I do that because I don't want to make decisions just for the sake of saying I did something. I want to make sure that it's going to be usable. So it might look like this. I want to implement utilizing images that provide seen and unseen diverse representations in my lectures, presentations, and videos because it will provide learners the opportunity to see themselves. By seeking out these intentional representations, learners will also see others beyond their own culture, and I will be able to plant seeds for tearing down stigmas and welcoming dialogue. So it helps me check myself. What am I want to do with this and why? So this inclusivity check is also in the little toolkit that you're going to get so that you'll know how to check what you want to do. So now we'll go over to questions.
Okay, Crystal, this has been a really busy chat area.
I can't see the chat area because actually I can see you, Megan, Wendy, Liz Norrell, and Adriana Lima y Silva. Like those are
so people are excited to get the copy of the recordings and all the resources afterwards. I think some of the questions that are coming up, one is about sample syllabus statements for the example that you gave. I don't know if you have any examples or if any of our colleagues on the call have any examples that they'd be willing to share.
So I didn't pull it up, but that's the great thing about technology is that I can actually, pull up a sample of a diversity statement. So, yeah, I will read.
And maybe while you're pulling that up, I can ask another question. Would that be okay? Okay. So while she's looking for that, one question or topic that got us a good amount of back and forth in the chat was about how do we as educators make space for students with views that aren't inclusive? For example, a student who told a queer professor that he didn't think that gay people should exist. And so I think both Kofi and Jeff really talked about this the element of respect and is key in communication. But I wanted to see if you would weigh in on that as well.
So one of the things that we have to admit is that inclusivity means providing everyone with a voice, even if that voice is a voice that is contrary to what you believe. However, what you can learn to do is help students who have those different voices, help them understand how maybe the rhetoric that they're using to voice what they mean is what needs to actually change. Sometimes students are, at any age, are repeating what they have learned and how they have heard it, but it may not actually be what they mean at all. So one, being okay with challenging a student and saying, can you expand on that, right? As opposed to just letting them take it at face value. Oftentimes I hear people will say, well, freedom of speech, I can say what I want. And I tell my students, you absolutely can, but freedom of speech is not free and it comes with consequences. So one of the things I want you to do is be mindful of how you express yourself. The other thing that I always ask students to do is to be able to find support. Can you, find support in this? What would happen if gay people should not exist? Do you know how many gay people there actually are that you might lose, whether that be friends or family or services that are being provided? And where they get that idea from, is that out of fear? Because they may be saying that out of fear because they've been told that, and maybe they are grappling with it themselves. So one of the things is, it is very much okay to do a pause, stop, and say, okay, that is what you want to say. However, is there a way that you can say that or mimic that behavior in a way that people would want to listen, right? And hold them to that accountability.
Great, thank you. We people are just loving you and very thankful for this engaging presentation. One thing that I'll say, Wendy, I think we should do is in addition to sending out all of Crystal's resources, many people in the comments have also shared a lot of resources as well. And so I think we should curate some of those resources to send out alongside the video of this session. Do you want to share the diversity statement now?
Right. So diversity statements have 2 or 3 parts. One, something like a tagline, right? And now this could be, some people consider it cheesy, right? Like people will say, everyone is included here, or whatever it might be. But whatever it is, make sure it's something that you can live by. The second part is actually explaining your why, right? Like, why does this matter to me? Why is this important to me? What is it, right? Like, how does this operate? And the third piece of that is actually providing action items. So I have my own consulting company in which I do diversity, equity, and inclusion training. And so for me, I have diversity statements in my classroom, but I also created a diversity statement for my business. And some people will say, well, why did you create a diversity statement when your entire business is about diversity? I'm like, I need to be able to support and mimic the behaviors that I want others to. So I will read you quickly like that diversity statement so that you can see how that works. So the headline is, diversity, equity, inclusion are not just hot topic words to use. They are action words to live by because some people's lives depend on them. My statement itself is, as a DEI-focused business, it is incumbent that we not only teach inclusive and equitable practices, but also exhibit them. Our commitment to diversity is personal. We support our community through actionable measures. We also believe in transparency. And then next, I tell how I achieve this, right? So for me, it's crystal clear plans, pledges to donate a portion of all profits to support organizations promoting social justice reform and issues impacting specifically Black women and girls, to commit to continuous learning on best practices for serving communities, businesses, and developing DEI. And third, to actively seek to work with minority and women-owned vendors and contractors for my internal business needs. So yours might be more focused on students. So example, some of mine for my action items for students is that students are allowed to utilize images that represent themselves. My students have the ability to correct others for their names. They can utilize pronouns. We hold each other accountable to doing that, but we do so in a loving manner or respectful. Like, I have very specific action items, and those kind of hand in hand with your inclusivity statement. Is because you're saying these are values. And one thing I would like to reiterate before we kind of wrap up, don't do this to be performative. doing these things because others are doing it and it is not part of your values. I would much rather a student be in your classroom and you be honest that this is not your wheelhouse than to fake that it is. So these performance, like it shouldn't be a performance. It needs to be something that you are going to track, that you're going to hold yourself accountable to. Values are things that we don't change very quickly. And so if these are values for you, then you're going to hold on to them and you're going to fight like heck to keep them, not just for yourself, but for your students. You have no idea what your students have dealt with before they get to your room. Right now, we know that domestic violence has increased because people are at home. We know that there are students who are in the LGBTQIA+ community who are stuck in homes right now in which they are not welcomed. And this may be the only space. There's some research that shows that a student having a trans student who has one caring adult, whether virtually or in person, is 40% less likely to commit suicide. Don't be the reason that you put someone over the edge. Black students are leaving schools as well as walking out of educational systems because they're like, I'm not welcomed here. No one ever acknowledges me. Don't be that person, but also don't do it to be a performance. You work and fight for it.
I can't think of a better way to end. So thank you so much, Professor Crystal Walker.
Yeah.
And it's been an honor to have you, and we will share this out with everyone. So
Yeah, and absolutely. So myself and one of my colleagues that's on here, her name is Professor Rachel Adams. We are going to be doing an event called Pride and Prejudice, in which we specifically talk about ways that you can become active, no longer performers or observers, active allies in ways to support racism or anti-racism work. I don't want you to support racism, anti-racism work, and also ways to support the LGBTQIA+ community. It is $25 to register. However, for all of you who are on the call, you will receive $10 off if you register through Friday. You will also get a digital toolkit. It'll be a lot more expensive. But this is work that you're going to learn how to do on an individual level as well as ways that you can take this to a larger place. We're going to be sharing our experiences in helping one another and specific actions that we took in our personal as well as professional lives to make sure that we were being supportive. So if you use the promo code MOL, it will give you $10 off, and you can get that $10 off through the 10th of this month. And Rachel and I are looking forward to it. It's on July 23rd at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
okay. Thank you all.
Thank you.